you take your seats, we'll get started, please. Our budget chair, Mr. Craig Jackson, is going to run this particular meeting. Elby?
Thank you, Mr. Attorney. Okay, let's start the meetings now with a roll call, and we'll start at this end of the table, Mr.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Lance Wilbur from the Office of Management and Budget.
Dan Moore, Mr. Treasurer.
Ethan Berkowitz, Mayor.
Bernie Hall, Assembly.
Jennifer Johnson.
Bill Evans.
Dick Training Zone.
Melody Gray Jackson.
Ken Scale. Pete Peterson.
Thank you. And Mr. Mayor, we understand that you want to make some comments before we start.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just wanted to, before we begin this discussion about proposed increases, just provide a little bit of context for where we are. The overall budget that our administration's put forward is $2 million smaller than it was last year. We've done that in spite of the fact that we've seen reductions in municipal assistance and revenue sharing of about $4 million. We've done it in spite of the fact that the ML&P dividend of about $7 million has gone away. We've done it in spite of the fact that the consumer price index was represented a 2.2% increase over the prior year, and we've done it in spite of the fact that there's been a population increase in our community. What I want to highlight with these increases, particularly those that are related to the traffic fines, is that there's a huge deterrent effect that accompanies increased fines. And as we struggle with an understaffed police force, we have to look for different ways of making our community safer. And the fact that our fine structure has been basically unchanged for 14 years means that the deterrent effect of those fines has lagged a little bit. And so just by highlighting the issue, I think it will have an effect in terms of making our streets safer. And we've seen increases in the rate of accidents and the rate of violations just because we haven't been able to put enough officers back in traffic, and the traffic was pulled down. As far as the other proposals, I want to mention that one of the responsibilities we have on an ongoing basis in terms of managing the city is to make sure that the infrastructure is as up to date as possible, and that the fee structures and the cost structures represent the current reality rather than the reality that was in place when they were imposed. So with that said, I will let Mr. Wilbur carry on, but I do want to note that you can cringe when I say this. I think it's very important that we recognize that our treasurer is in charge of more revenues. Last name is Moore. So.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Before we go on, I'd like to recognize, and on the record that we have Mr. Bosky here. Thank you. Mr. Wilbur, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our agenda today is to review the proposed ordinance, omnibus ordinance, as it relates to fines and fees for primarily 4 departments: the police department, development services, health and human services, and parks and recreation. Your presentation is in a PowerPoint packages presented in this order, and if it would please the chair, what we'd like to do is go ahead and do the police department and follow with parks and recreation. The director has a previous engagement that he has to meet at 4, so we'd like to accommodate that if that's okay with you.
That's fine.
Okay. So in addition to some of the mayor's opening remarks, again, we do have this fiscal challenge that we have, this $11 million hole, and the way in which this budget, as you've heard in your previous presentations, we're working with a combinations of things, including these proposed revenue increases. Maybe to highlight at a very large scale some of the way in which we did this, and I'm going to ask Dan to jump in here before we get started, is, we really took a hard look at all of the proposals, whether it's the operations, the customer needs, the projections on where we've come from and where we think we're going to go to. So a lot of those elements were considered when we proposed this revenue adjustment. The total amount, if all of the proposals are accepted, is $1.4 million. And if you kind of, in a general sense, how we break that down is about $721,000 would come from traffic fines. The $275,000 would come from driving without insurance and texting, if that's approved. And a copy of that ordinance was provided to you earlier today. It was submitted on the addendum to the agenda, and we'll look forward to that being introduced to the Assembly on Tuesday night as well. Development Services, and we'll let them talk to you about that. They have some adjustments for their e-planning that would account for $250,000 a year. Health and Human Services, through a variety of proposals they have, would accumulate to about $150,000 a year. And the Parks and Recreation, through some additions and subtractions, would count to a little more than $21,000 a year. So, I mean, I really think it's a modest proposal that the administration is proposing as it relates to all of the things that have been considered. I know there's a lot of interest in the fines and the fees from the APD. So before I turn it over to APD, I'm going to ask Dan just make a little bit, maybe some more opening comments about some of the scrubbing and the analysis that we went through when we did this proposal, and then turn it over to our folks at APD.
And Mr. Wilbur, if you don't mind, Mr. Trainee has a question.
Yes.
Relative to driving without insurance, at one time we passed an ordinance that required you to have insurance. Then the Assembly, when we had Paul Bauer on the Assembly, changed it to only have to show that you had it within 3 days of being stopped by a police officer. And so how does this change that?
I think what I'd like to do is when we get to the APD presentation, if we can get their answer from APD or from legal, that would be great.
I'd be interested to how much of a fine, for instance, we just got it.
Absolutely.
So thank you.
That'd be great.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. Ms. Johnson has a question.
Just an overall question, and maybe you're going to hit this when you're talking about scrubbing it, but we did an omnibus bill like this 5 years ago?
Somewhere around there.
And since you have the institutional knowledge, are any of these ones that we changed in that bill, or are these new regulatory?
These are new to my knowledge.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Please continue.
So I'll ask Dan maybe to talk a little bit about how we prepared the proposal and some of the work that the Treasury Department does in preparing this before we jump into the individual departments, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. So through the chair, I'll just give some background in terms of Treasury's role and kind of how it all ultimately started working with APD. Our focus for adjustments to fines and fees this cycle was really focused on APD. And I think what's mentioned on there, if you do the percentages of this omnibus bill, 70% of it is APD. So that's why we're starting out with them. Our focus in looking at APD fines is very much on the public safety, what the mayor just mentioned, the deterrent effect. We do a lot of collections in our area, and we've seen the collections go way down. Basically, the response from the community is that they know there's not as much enforcement, and they know the fines are not, they haven't changed in a long time. It's 14 to 15 years. So we looked at that knowing that there was a need to try to review the fines, and we looked at the history of all APD fines from way back when, and we found out what the ordinance sources were and all the details associated with that. We also looked at what year they were actually last changed, and then we analyzed when was the last comprehensive change that was made. It was in 2001. At that time, speeding tickets, just as an example, went up 32%. And it was a very comprehensive bill, but that was in 2001. Since then, there have only been a couple dozen changes to APD fines with very, very little activity. So what we did is we looked at the history, we had the complete list of all their fines, and then we said, as a matter of perspective, let's look at what these fines would be in today's dollars. And when we did this, we actually were looking at it as if it were 2016. So we adjusted for inflation, and we looked at what those amounts would be. That was just a point of perspective. That's not reality. What we did after that is we reached out to APD and we said, we think there's a need here, and we consulted with the administration, and we said we need help to start reviewing the details of these fines and to see what specific recommendations they would have to make. So the focus by APD, primarily the most time they spent, the most changes they affected were in non-speeding ticket areas. And those are all over the universe of possible infractions. So that's what it started out with. That amounted to about $100,000 of change. The other $6,000 to $7,000 of change focus on the speeding tickets. What the police department recommended, and they'll get into this when they get more into the presentation, is how the The old way of doing it was per mile, and how there could be simplicity injected into the process by doing a tiered pricing. And so that's something that they will go over, but part of Treasury's role is not only look at the history, look at the revenues, look at the whether or not there's a need for an update, but it's also to look at what the trends are, both with collections and with the volume of tickets. We have seen in the last 2 years that the volume of tickets issued, traffic tickets, is 50%, almost 50% less than what the long-term historical average has been. We also looked at what are traffic fines in relation to APD's overall operating budget as a revenue source. They're 2.5%. They're not a huge piece of the revenue. They're primarily supported with property taxes. So when we look to make the adjustments, we worked with APD. We ultimately came up with what you see in the proposed ordinance. There was a change, correction that we made when we handed that out to you in terms of the way the tiered pricing occurs. And we've seen that the ordinance that you have before you, which is AO 2015-111, is going to need some correction. So part of an S version that will be coming to you will include the correction on tiered fines for APD speeding tickets. Just a couple other comments here. Let's see just a moment. We also looked at our scofflaw list. As many of you know, the city has a special list of what we call scofflaws. They're the people that have the most violations that are out there that they have not paid. So by definition, if you owe $1,000 or more, you're considered a scofflaw. You go on a special list. APD gets an update of that list every single morning, and they're able to tow cars, to impound cars when they have their very next infraction. By increasing the traffic fines, not only do you send the message to the general community that there's a bigger consequence, and many people will try to avoid even getting a traffic ticket because they know the consequence is bigger. But those that continue to get traffic tickets, that continue to drive unsafe, like scofflaws, will enter that realm of further consequence, which is impounding their car. So there is a lot that can be done here, both with the level of enforcement through fines and a level of resource that APD will hopefully grow over time, that is going to turn the tide on traffic enforcement and have it be more updated and definitely taken more seriously so that we can have safer roads overall. That is, I'm going to point to a couple slides that are it's on page 5. If we can do that. And this is where there's correction, page 5 and 6. So if you can look at the 2-page handout, we have red on top, it's a corrected page. On this particular page, what we show is a comparison, and this is specifically the speeding tickets. Of the total changes that are proposed for APD, 85% of those relate to speeding tickets in terms of fiscal impact. So we wanted to make sure that you all understood what it was under the old system and what it is under the new system. This shows you an example of the tiered pricing, and APD will talk more in depth about this and certainly take any questions you have. But what this shows is the per mile method, both for sort of standard school zones and for standard speed zones and then school zones, and then how it goes into a tiered model after that. What we did for comparison purposes is we showed you what a ticket would be in various price ranges or ticket level ranges under the old system and under the new system. So you can compare what our changes are just within the city. On the second page, what we did further, because part of what Treasury does is we research a lot of things in terms of not just what does Anchorage do, but what do other jurisdictions do and how do we fall into that. We compared ourselves first and foremost to the Alaska State Troopers, because there is a state law that governs all areas of Alaska where you don't otherwise have your own traffic ordinances. On the second page, you see the comparison to the Alaska State Troopers for comparable levels of fines. This is comparing the current trooper citation amounts to what the revised, updated amounts would be for APD. And you can see that the fine differences are very, very small. We're not any major difference at all from the troopers. And in fact, in the couple, especially when you get to the higher speeding, the 20, 29 range, we're virtually exactly the same. I mean, it's very, very close. So we did that comparison, and basically The last piece that we did, which I'll say, is we also get involved with revenue analysis, revenue projection, revenue estimation. So when you see what's built into the budget, what's in the summary of economic effects, that came from Treasury, analyzing the potential volume of tickets, the new pricing, and all the other factors that go into it. A lot of tickets are correctable, a lot of them are contested. There's all these, a lot of them are not collectible in the first year. We factored all those things in, we discounted it down, and the numbers that you have in the summary of economic effects show a middle of the road, no pun intended, achievable level of revenue for 2016. We will need to revisit this in 2016 based on actual experience, because this is a change that affects a lot of different fine levels. Until we see the results of that change, we can't tell you that this will be the way it is forever. So we will definitely revise or relook at this a year from now, but this is our best estimation in terms of what can be generated by this. The second piece that relates to traffic, and this is my last comment, is the prosecutor's office was involved, and they're going to talk to the details here, but there were 2 different traffic fines that involved more than just changing the fine, and there are more policy changes, and we're changing from criminal matters to a fine, and that indeed dealt with screen devices that are operated while driving, and also driving without insurance. And that is the ordinance that is handed out today, and that is something that will be discussed by the municipal prosecutor who's here. Other than that, I mentioned earlier, this is the last thing, we do have plans for next version. There should be a lot of changes for APD based on what we know, but if there's other changes that the Assembly wants, those can be considered and incorporated also. And other than that, that's all I have for summary.
Thank you. Mr. Trainee?
Dan, have you looked at the cost factor of the increases to our legal department with these fines and fees? Because you've got to figure out there'd be more legal things going to the legal department to prosecute. Have you figured out what the factor on that would be?
We did not consider that on this round. That is potentially an impact as we get into the actual experience of what these fines produce. A lot of these, the volume of fines is actually pretty much the same. The consequences have gone up. And so there is certainly the chance that more people may contest those consequences. But there's also situations where maybe in the past, the prosecutor's office or a police officer would have to go on a criminal misdemeanor and appear. Now it's becoming a fine, and it's more straightforward, and there's actually less prosecutor time, less APD time that's spent on those types of cases. So there's some trade-offs.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. Mr. Wilk, please.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. So I think what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, I know Dan's given us a thorough rundown of the explanation of the proposed fines and fees. If I could get Chief Gillum and Sergeant LeBlanc to come up here and maybe talk about some of the things for the fire department, or if you have questions, we can speak from there. So the police department, as mentioned to Dan, the police departments, they are recommending some proposed changes, and the So as Dan mentioned, we've worked very well with the police department on recommending these things, recommending these changes, and I know that both of these gentlemen were at the Assembly's Public Safety Committee earlier this week to present some of the highlights of that proposal as well. Again, there's a long list of our comprehensive list of proposed fines and fees, and I know that the Assembly during the Public Safety Committee had some additional recommendations they'd like to possibly consider. As Dan mentioned, we did compare this with the state troopers, and I think, the one significant difference, if there is one, it has to do with speeding in school zones. If you're going more than 30 miles an hour in a school zone, that's probably the largest difference here. There's penalties different than it would be for the state troopers. So, again, a lot of analysis was done, so I think with that, I'll turn it over to the Chief Gillum and Sergeant LeBlanc. And if you guys have any questions about what the proposal is, the logic behind it as it relates to their ability to enforce these, the logic and how they're being applied, I will turn it over to you, Madam Chair, and members of the Assembly and APD.
Good afternoon. Through the chair, ladies and gentlemen of the Assembly, Your Honor. Thank you for the opportunity for us to discuss these issues with you. This is something that's important to the Anchorage Police Department. We do have our subject matter expert, Sergeant LeBlanc, here, and I will turn it over to him to explain these particular changes. If you have any questions, we will certainly be available later. Thank you. Sergeant.
Good afternoon. My name is Roy LeBlanc. I'm the Sergeant of the Anchorage Police Department Traffic Unit. I was approached in September to participate in this review of the traffic fines and submit recommendations for some amendments. Before I get into a lot of that, I'd like to kind of place things in context for everybody. January 9th, Peter Albert. January 21st, Lena Matapa. March 4th, Russell Place. March 27th, Desiree Lamont. April 3rd, Thomas Goebel. April 3rd, Derek Monk. April 19th, Kevin Gonzalez. May 9th, Leroy Blitz. May 27th, Young Lore. May 29th, Robert Seeley. July 3rd, Carlos Chavesta. July 31st, Claudia Kazakin. September 6th, Bobby Joe Jones. September 21st, Nathaniel Hollywood. September 29th, James Baldwin. October 2nd, Tyrone Milton. October 10th, Geraldo Rios. October 11th, Justin Jones. October 14th, Fred Shoemaker. Those are 19 deaths that have occurred on Anchorage's roads so far this year. All these deaths I would consider preventable. It's interesting hearing fiscal folks talk about these ordinances, especially when they're talking about the speed violations, because they're referring to them as pricing categories. When I look at these, I actually refer to these as blocks of behavior. 3 to 9 miles per hour is a block of behavior. It's not a pricing model. 10 to 19, that's a block of behavior. Each one is more dangerous than the prior block. Studies have shown that higher speeds significantly increase the resulting injuries or deaths when you're involved in a car collision. So when I reviewed all these different ordinances, I was presented with a spreadsheet that had all the different ordinances within our fine structure, what the consumer price intake increase has been since the last time it was evaluated, and then a recommended increase. When I looked at these increases, some of them are pretty significant. A lot of these fines haven't been changed since 2001. Some of these fines, the recommendation was over 100% increase. When you look at some of these high dollar citations, 100% increase would be a huge burden on the public. So when I looked at all the different pricing models or fine amounts, I tried to look at it through the eyes of a citizen on what would be reasonable. I also looked at what the actual increase in income has been for Anchorage residents. So according to the census data from 2000 to 2013, the median income in Anchorage has increased about 42%. It's less than actually what the CPI has been, and I think most of us probably have felt that when we go to the store, the dollars we have don't go quite as far. So we have to kind of balance increasing the penalties with the goal of increasing highway safety with what the public can actually afford. We don't want to become an economic oppressive force in the society of Anchorage, but we want them to drive safer. 19 deaths for a city our size is way too many, and we're just getting into our really bad driving months. So we really need to do something. Of course, our staffing levels are starting to grow now, so we'll be able to increase our productivity. But for 2015, we're only projected to write about 28,000 citations. And we only write tickets to about 70 to 75% of people we stop. So when you look at the total number of traffic stops, it's really not that great for the volume of traffic we have in the city. And our drivers notice that. When they drive around, they see that there's not enough cops stopping them. Recently, a couple of months ago, we actually embarked on a zero tolerance campaign on the Glen Highway. And we called everybody that we could, detectives, anybody commuting to and from work, stop every car you can, zero tolerance. Just in 1 week alone, I noticed about a 10 mile per hour drop in the average speed on the Glen Highway. So we know that we can actually impact safety on our roads, but it's difficult and challenging. And by changing the fine structure, by increasing the fines, contrary to what the fiscal folks will say, I think actually, hopefully if it works, we'll see a decrease in revenue. Because what we'll see is an increase in compliance, because the penalty is a deterrent effect. Looking at the model for the speed limits, by breaking down our speed tickets into groups of behavior versus a per mile hour fine system, It does a couple of things for us. One of the things it does first is it simplifies the system. We don't have to worry about cops trying to do some math out in the field, multiplying X number of miles per hour over whatever the dollar amount is for that particular fine range. So it simplifies that. The other thing, it actually gives us the ability to analyze the driving behavior in Anchorage a little bit better. Currently, we can tell you we wrote over 5,000 speeding tickets last year, but I cannot tell you how many of those were going 17 over the limit, 8 over the limit, 30 over the limit, because they're all cited under the same ordinance. It's the same ticket. It's actually the manual entry that the officer makes on the citation that actually breaks down the speed. By breaking it out into these categories, we'll be able to tell the following year how many tickets we wrote in the 3 to 9 range, how many tickets we wrote 10 to 19. And hopefully what we'll see is first year we're going to be writing a lot, probably in the 20, 29 and over. Maybe that number starts to go down. It would be really nice if we started only seeing tickets in the 3 to 9 mile per hour range. So this gives us the ability to actually analyze driver behavior so we can focus our efforts better. And the other thing that it does is the public is very clear about what the penalty is for the behavior. They don't have to wonder about if I go 6 miles over, is that going to cost me X dollars? If I go 8 over, is it going to cost me more? They just know 3 to 9 is this flat dollar amount. This is going to be your fine. Realistically, do we write tickets for 3? We don't. The tickets that you'll see in these categories are going to be at the top of each range. You'll see tickets for 8 to 9 miles over. You'll see tickets probably 15 to 19 over, and then you'll see tickets in the mid-20s and higher. Generally, when a police officer does a traffic stop for speeding, they automatically are going to reduce the violation to a lower level. They're going to account for an error in the speed measuring device, and then usually they'll try and bump it down to a lower category to be a little bit less punitive on the citizen. The reality of the matter is cops don't like writing tickets. You know, most of us have received tickets. It's just a matter of something we have to do because we do know that they are effective.
Finished?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Sergeant Brown. Mr. Evans?
Thank you. I have just a couple questions. You indicated that in September you were approached about this issue. Who was it that approached you about this?
It was the Treasury Department through my chain of command.
And it's also been indicated in here that these tickets haven't gone up, the price of the tickets, since 2001. Are you aware of any efforts by the APD from 2001 until now to get the administration to raise the tickets for that deterrent effect you're talking about?
I am not, but I will add that I've only been in charge of the traffic here for 2 years.
Chief, if you're...
I'm not aware of any earlier than I either.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Mr. Tree? Okay, thank you. Thank you again, Sergeant Brown.
Excuse me?
Ms. Johnston?
So you're aware the last couple of years that the revenues haven't been what has been budgeted for.
Yes.
And we were told when the APD was doing their first budget presentation that there were going to be new ways of addressing it. And I thought it was other than just raising the fees. Are you going to be addressing traffic violations differently, more aggressively? What?
Well, since I took over the trafficking, one of the things that I've been trying to do is I've been trying to find new ways to actually become more efficient with our enforcement, and then also been seeking as many grant sources as we can for grant-funded enforcement. For example, on the books we have 500 hours of overtime that's going to be funded through Alaska Highway Safety Office if it's approved by the Assembly for holiday enforcement in December. We worked a very large clicker ticket campaign in May where we wrote over 1,000 tickets in less than 3 weeks. Those campaigns are very effective because they're paid for with grant money, and it's overtime, so it's additional enforcement that we normally wouldn't have. And the nice thing about those is those details actually are required to target the violations that are part of the Alaska Highway Safety Improvement Plan, which that would be occupant protection, speed, DUI, and distracted driving. So they narrowly focus to those particular offenses.
Can I do a follow-up on that?
Sure.
And you brought up a good point. Grants are usually fund overtime. Will you have the manpower for the overtime to be able to effectively use those grants?
So far, I've only had one occurrence occurrence, we had, during the president's visit, which was a lot of overtime. We had multiple DOT projects that we're trying to finish before the end of the year. So we had a DUI enforcement detail, and we did have trouble filling it. But we managed to fill it because some of the more junior officers were able to work it.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Mr. Trainee?
Just a couple of questions. Sorry. On page 6 of 25 and 29, you've got listed down here, carrying animals outside vehicle, $75 fine. Is that related to people who have dogs in the back of their pickup? They're finable? A lot of people put their dogs in the back of the pickup, thought we're straight and drive around town. Is that the reason we have that fine there?
You said 6, line 29?
Line 29, carrying animals outside vehicle. On page 6 of 25.
So that's 936-115.
Yep.
Carrying animals on, outside of the
Outside
vehicle.
vehicle.
No person driving a motor vehicle shall transport any animal in the back of the vehicle in a space intended for any load on the vehicle on a street unless the space is enclosed or has side and tail walls to a height of at least 46 inches extending vertically from the floor, or the animal is cross-tethered to the vehicle, or is protected by a secure container or cage, in a manner in which will prevent the animal from being thrown, falling, or jumping from the vehicle.
Okay, so that would pertain to dogs from back of pickups?
If they're loose, if they're cross-tethered, so if they're
But if they're
on a
untethered,
leash where they, basically, if they can jump out, then it would be illegal. If they can't jump out, then it wouldn't be.
I could call some dog advocates concerned that the city never enforces that. If we're gonna have it on here, like you guys please enforce it.
Yes, sir.
Would please. The other one is page 7 of 25, line 5. Driving on Fire Lake, $100 fine. What makes Fire Lake any different from Green Lake, from Goose Lake? Should it just be on a lake?
My understanding is Fire Lake is specifically identified in our codes because it's actually, I guess for lack of better words, a water airport. So airplanes take off and land on that lake.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. Mr. Bosky?
I'm just trying to figure it
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I was gonna say, go ahead, that one right on the map. There's a lot of airplanes on the lake. Since we're talking about, I wasn't gonna bring this up, I was just content to listen, but since we're talking about animals in public places, on page 21 and 25, there's a $100 fine. It's proposed to go up $25 for the first violation of having an animal in a public place. So does that mean if somebody has their little chihuahua in their jacket, that's illegal? That's fine for me. I'm just curious, I never knew that was an issue.
That's actually an animal control ordinance that I'm
Let's get them in a minute. I've got to
We'll ask them too. So just for the animal control people in the room, when you come up, I'm gonna ask you about alligators too. And Sergeant LeBlanc, I just wanna put you on the record here. So you're telling me if I'm driving 5 over, I'm not gonna get pulled over?
No, that's not what I said. And I'll clarify for the record, I said you probably wouldn't get a speeding ticket. I've written tickets to people driving 3, 4, 5 miles over the limit, but not speeding tickets. We have another ordinance that's called fail to obey a traffic control device. It's a lesser offense, and generally that's what is written for a speeding ticket that maybe doesn't justify a speeding ticket. It's pretty common knowledge that if you have a speeding ticket on your driving record, that could cause your insurance rates to go up, and officers try to be compassionate when enforcing the law, and that's one way we can still hold you accountable for your actions, but maybe not punish you quite as much.
Well, I usually set my cruise control. I'll just set it a little lower now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bosky. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I haven't had a chance to go through all 25 pages of this, but I've had citizens complaining to me about people running red lights, and I see it fairly regularly myself. Is the fine for that going up, and I've been told that that actually is a state law, that we actually can't raise that ourselves. Is any of that
We
correct?
actually could raise that. My recommendation was that we didn't, because it's already set at a pretty high dollar amount. The issue with red lights comes down to a matter of enforcement. We need more enforcement, and we can only do that with more officers.
Okay. Well, obviously it's really dangerous, because
It is.
someone runs a red light, they can kill someone, So I think that one should be high on the list of questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Ms. Johnston?
Well, I have to do this. On page, let's see, starting on page 7 and 8, you have the bicycle one. And some of these I think are already in code, but I'm concerned about enforcement of some of them. The writing on the sidewalk, that one's kind of an interesting one because actually we have members of your department that have right on the sidewalk in the summer, along with me. So I'm curious what you're going to do with that one.
So all the codes that are in this bill are actually existing codes. There's no new codes, there's no language change. This bill is simply just amendments to the fine. There are lots of problems in our Title IX code. There's lots of things that need to be updated. For example, there's one in here about children wearing a bicycle helmet. And it sets the fine at X for the first offense and Y for a second offense. There are not any method to determine if they had the first offense to begin with. So it's very hard to enforce. Concerning riding a bicycle on a sidewalk, that only applies to the downtown business district. And yes, it's somewhat hypocritical because we do have police officers riding bicycles on the sidewalk in the summertime in the downtown business district. They also ride on the roads. I'm not sure how we're going to fix that. Police officers do get the options and the privilege of being able to violate traffic laws and perform sort of official duties. They get to drive fast within speed limit. They get to drive the wrong way on one-way roads. There has to be obviously a mission need for that. Maybe this is an ordinance that the Assembly might consider changing.
Okay, but and it seems, did you increase the ticket on that?
Right.
Huh?
The actual ordinance is primarily, the reason why that riding bicycles on the sidewalk ordinance applies only to the downtown business district is because of the high volume of pedestrians in the downtown business district. Incidentally, though, that happens to also be where the need for the SROs on bicycles exists.
Just for folks' information, I found that we tend to develop a sense of community and a sense of graciousness when you have multi-purpose sidewalks and trails. I'm sure your SROs don't run into people as they're riding their bicycles, and I'm sure they don't just go squealing by and not say on the left. Pardon me. Anyways, the other, you've got, you have riding on bicycles on roadways or bike paths. Page 8 also.
Is that line 4 and 5?
Yeah.
That section of code basically relates to the proper operation. So staying on the right side of the path or trail, exercising due care to avoid hazards when you're passing or meeting vehicles, pedestrians, or other users of the trail. So that's kind of goes back to the
Trail etiquette.
Trail etiquette, being a good user.
Etiquette was the word I was searching for. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Mr. Hall?
Thank you, Madam Chair. One comment I would make when we refer to the comment about none of this happening since 2001 being a long time. That doesn't happen because Mr. Mayor is not politically correct to raise fees. The public out there immediately goes, oh my God, what are you doing to me? I'm sure in 2001, when the prices were set at that time, it wasn't to be a revenue generator, it was to be a deterrent. The fact that for an action there was a consequence, and hopefully that consequence will set a degree that it deters people from doing it. I can tell you that when I went through this the first time, the next time I drove, I was very aware of what I was doing and how I was driving. So it's already working for me. I'll tell you that for a fact. But I would probably have a real concern about this if we were doing a fee change and adding 45 police officers down and enforcing it. It appears to me the only revenue that we're looking at it generating in this is going to be no more tickets. It's just going to be if they got the tickets last year that they're going to be getting this year. We're not talking about more tickets. It's just the additional revenue. That uptick in what the cost is going to be, which we hope will be the deterrent that the mayor is referring to. That increased feel. I know that we're not going to be able to come up with officers. It appears that today we're having a bigger problem just dealing with our spice issue. It's going to take more officers to deal with that. So I've had these discussions in the entire time that I've been on this body, never before in regards to moving violations, but we've had some of our utilities that are clinging by the hair of their chinny chin chin, and we have discussions there about increasing the revenue, and the body basically immediately goes, wait a minute, we're not really don't want to go there because the public reacts negatively to that. But sometimes I think we have a responsibility as elected officials to make sure that we do keep these current and we don't turn around where every 15 or 16 years we make an adjustment instead of it being maybe 3 or 5%, all of a sudden it's 100%. So, I'll be supporting it. There's some that I have some other issues with, but I think I understand what you're trying to do, and quite honestly, I appreciate it. We need to do that on a much more regular basis.
Thank you, Mr. Ball. Mr. Basky?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I forgot, I had one more question related to the potential grant money we have for overtime during the holiday season. So with that said, can you just remind me with APD's overtime, so the officers, you guys aren't on a rotational basis, it's by seniority, right?
Yes.
And that would apply to that grant money, right?
Yes.
And so the time that officer works, if it happens to be one of his or her high threes, does that count towards their retirement?
It would depend on which retirement plan they're in. I think currently we have seven different retirement plans based on when you were hired.
So tier 1, 2, let's see.
So police and fire overtime would not count. For tier 2 and 3 PERS, it would count. For tier 4, it would not.
Okay. And the majority of the officers right now are above tier 4, right?
By above, do you mean they're tier 2 or 3?
Yeah.
I think we're about probably fairly close to 50-50 split now. We actually still have a few police and fire old timers around as well. But I think as far as tier 2 and 3, and then tier 4, we're pretty close on patrol to a 50-50 split.
So it would be logical, since you're still on seniority though, that the tier 2 and 3 are the ones with the most seniority over the tier 4 employees. So they'll probably be the ones that get first shot at that overtime, right?
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Basky. Ms. Johnson?
Back to bicycles. There's been an increase of electrical bicycles.
Yes.
And I'm not sure if it's because the business went out of business and there's a good deal on it. But as you look at bicycle enforcement, I think maybe we should start looking at the electrical bicycles. I saw one yesterday that beat me downtown. I was in a car and was very erratic on sidewalks, etc. So I just wanted to mention it.
And electric bicycles are already addressed in our code. It just comes down to a matter, once again, of enforcement. There's maximum speed limits for bicycles riding on the sidewalk, but do we have the time and ability to enforce that?
So it would only be if somebody was riding erratically or making others do.
Or if they caused an accident. There are some cities that are very aggressive with their bicycle enforcement. I've seen a really neat gadget that they attach on the actual handlebars, and officers go out and ride in the roadway to make sure that cars that are passing them are passing at the proper distance, the space between them. That's someplace I'd love for us to be at sometime in the future, but I think we're a few years at least away from having the resources to be able to do things Madam Chairman, if I maybe make a comment concerning the grant funding.
Sure.
I think it's important for everyone to realize that on these reimbursable grants, we're actually reimbursed not only for the cost of salaries, but also for the cost of benefits. So, it's not really what retirement program somebody's in, and if they're increasing their retirement by working overtime, that doesn't actually create an additional cost for the municipality.
Mr. Trainee?
Mr. LeBlanc, segways, what do we count those as? Are those considered bikes or HOVs or what? HVs, whatever it is. What do we consider segways?
They're in a special class by themselves. Many years ago, probably within the last 10, the Assembly passed additional ordinances. One of the interesting things about wheeled vehicles on the sidewalks, we basically differentiate between tandem and non-tandem wheeled vehicles. So a Segway would be a non-tandem wheeled vehicle. So a lot of these sections of the code that apply to bicycles and other things do not apply to non-tandem wheeled vehicles like a Segway. It would be my impression that that was done on purpose to allow for the downtown tour enterprises stuff to be able to operate those on the sidewalks safely versus being in with traffic.
So we can't have a bike downtown, but you can have a Segway downtown.
Correct.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. Mr.
Perfect
Evans?
sense.
Mr. Evans?
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to be another part of the discussion, but I just didn't want to get away without talking about the texting thing. Are we on that yet, or is that coming up? Okay.
That's coming up.
All right.
Thank
Then I'll
you,
just wait.
Mr. Evans. Anything else, Sergeant Woodlock?
No, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rowe, please continue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Evans. I think we'll move on to some other elements that are related to the police department, but I'm going to ask our folks from the legal department to come up and talk about these proposed changes. As the ordinance that was put on the addendum and then passed out to you today, the proposals to make some changes, as Dan Moore mentioned, related to driving without insurance and driving with while operating a screen device. I'm going to invite Seneca to come and join us. And yes, I know that it was just given to you, so if you have some overall questions, we'll try to address those, and as you get a chance to get a little more detail, we'll look forward to your specific questions and comments, and we'll respond later. So, Madam Chair, thank you.
Thank you. Seneca Pino, City Prosecutor. There are, in the addendum ordinance here, there are two statutes that are at issue, two codes at issue. They are driving without insurance and driving a motor vehicle while a screen device is operating. Those are both misdemeanors currently prosecuted by my office. For driving without insurance, that is a Class B misdemeanor. It's punishable by up to a $2,000 fine and up to 90 days in jail. For the driving with a screen device operating, that is a Class A misdemeanor, punishable by up to 1 year in jail and a $10,000 fine. Our proposal here is to reduce the penalty on both of those offenses to a violation. They would no longer be misdemeanors. They would be prosecuted in the same way that other traffic offenses are, through a citation. The driving without insurance, essentially the language in the ordinance combined the wording from the driving without insurance and driving without proof of insurance into one behavior. They are now together with a $500 fine. That is correctable, which means that if the person failed to have proof of their insurance with them at the time they were stopped, they would still receive the citation. But if they show that proof of insurance that was valid at the time they were stopped, either to the police department or to the court system, the ticket would be invalidated. We certainly don't want to ticket anybody or penalize anybody who actually had the insurance. They would both be optional appearance tickets, meaning the person could choose to simply pay the fine, or they could request a traffic trial if they wanted to contest it, and that traffic trial would be held at the courthouse in front of a magistrate. And that is the general summary of what these ordinances do. The ordinance itself is quite lengthy, simply because we did have to make some changes to the impound ordinance as well, just to accommodate the fact that the driving without insurance would no longer be a misdemeanor.
Thank you. I don't know your last name, but I don't want to call you Ms. Seneca.
My last name is Thino.
Thank you, Mr. Evans.
My understanding is, at least from something I've seen somewhere, was that the rationale for moving it from a criminal offense to a violation, at least with respect to the screen devices, was because it's more difficult to prosecute those cases. Thus, the concern was if it's a violation, we can issue more tickets for it, technically. Can you explain to me what what is the difficulty in prosecuting those cases that we're trying to avoid?
Sure, absolutely. So when it's prosecuted as a misdemeanor, that means we're going to district court. They have the right to a defense attorney and the right to a jury trial in front of a judge. The standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the same as in traffic court, but obviously we're appealing not simply to a single judicial officer, but to an entire jury panel. Those cases, when they're investigated by the police department, are oftentimes rely almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. So the officer may see some kind of driver behavior and then see a cell phone out of the console or whatever. They might try and get some admissions from the driver that they're on the phone. They may not be able to collect good evidence. In our office with our caseload, we're looking at what the quality is of the case that's coming forward to us and whether we think we can take that to a jury and get proof to that evidence, to that level that's necessary. In addition, so when you're resolving the ticket in traffic court with not a defense attorney necessarily and not a jury panel, the reality is that oftentimes appealing just to a judicial officer can be easier to make your case. That's a reality. In addition to that, traffic offenses do not require a mens rea, so we don't have to know that the person acted knowingly or recklessly or to any other standard. The question is, did they do the behavior for which they've been cited? Yes or no?
No, just follow. Which makes a lot of sense. I fully understand that. This is also, though, the same philosophy that led us to make SPICE a violation as opposed to a criminal offense, if I recall correctly. And it hasn't worked famously in that regard. I was just wondering if we think it'll be different in this respect.
There were other considerations with regards to SPICE, and I know eventually we'll end up talking about those. A lot of those have to do with specific proof considerations related to lab testing, and I do think that ordinance as written, as the violation, works extremely well in targeting the retail stores, which was what it was primarily designed to do. This offense is cited regularly by APD, both at the higher level misdemeanor driving, I'm sorry, we're talking about texting. It is not cited very frequently right now. I do believe that that is because of communication from our office to officers about the difficulty in proving those cases and the hesitancy to perhaps give someone such a potential high penalty for behavior that didn't necessarily result in any bad action, an accident, for example. So I do expect officers to take advantage of this offense as a violation with more frequency than they have as a misdemeanor.
You want to continue?
Just one.
Certainly, please
I just
do.
want to comment. I appreciate that, and I'd support anything that I thought would reduce people texting while driving, because I think it is. If you'd have come forward and said, we're going to issue the death penalty for texting, I'd have given it, as much consideration as I give this, because I think it's a little hyperbolic, but I think, my main concern on this is that, in fact, it's an offense that should be treated with the utmost severity. This may be better. I'm just not sure, but I think that the main concern is that we have to certainly deter that behavior in any way we can. And I would certainly like to say, have people face jail time for that offense, because we have dead people that result from that, even though that particular time you catch them may not be the time they injure somebody. It is such a inherently hazardous undertaking that I'm concerned about this.
Sure, and if I can respond to that in 2 points. One is, it is in the language of the AM for this ordinance, but the number of referrals of this charge to my office is very low, and the number of convictions is extremely low. Oftentimes, this behavior occurs in conjunction with something more egregious, an OUI, reckless driving, a leaving the scene of a crash, for example. This being in negotiations, this charge is oftentimes dismissed in conjunction with trying to get a plea deal. By having it as a violation, it can be handled completely separately, and therefore the officers are still entirely permitted to cite for the higher level misdemeanor or felony behavior. They can still also cite for this violation. So it may end up in more deterrence because more behavior is actually being targeted.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Mr. Hall?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm very appreciative of this. 2 years ago, we actually managed to put on our legislative request a state statute in regards to texting while driving. And actually managed to build a fair amount of momentum thanks to the efforts of David White, former president of Alyeska Pipeline, who since he retired has taken up a full-time job as a crosswalk guard at an elementary school. And the things that he encounters in those crosswalks and in school zones. We were only trying to get it no texting in school zones. And the wherewithal wasn't there at the state level to do anything about it. So I'm excited to see this come along. I think it's desperately needed. I know I had a young lady 2 years ago that lost her life on Diamond Boulevard texting and driving under a dump truck. So this thing just, it's the right time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Wall. I agree with you 100%. Mr. Steele?
Yeah, I can see the diversion of attention. If a person has an old style phone and they're talking on the phone, are they liable for a ticket?
If they're talking,
Yeah.
no.
But somebody with a new style phone happens to have a screen if they're talking on the phone, they would be?
No. Both in the state statute and in our ordinance, the talking while driving is absolutely permitted. And that was
Even though it says operating the screen device.
with a screen device operating, correct. If you look at the legislative history for the state statute that preceded ours, it's absolutely clear that they had no intention whatsoever of stopping anyone from using it in hands-free mode, in GPS mode, while making a phone call, so on and so forth. Those behaviors are completely
It's going to be
permissible.
tough to determine which one.
Sometimes indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Steele. Anything else, Ms. Steele?
I just want to make sure Mr. Kearney's question about no insurance got answered.
I think it did.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Steele. Mr. Steele, please continue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'd like to go ahead and go to your last slide and have Parks do their presentation. Yes, yes. The APD is going to take off. So I think I have the director and John Rada and Ms. Stanton. Thank you, John. So if you look at your last slide, in the summary into the ordinance, this is a summary of Parks and Recreation's proposed changes. I think they have some modest changes to their recreation, their a couple camp programs, and then making some changes as proposed for concessions, and then some adjustments in their fees for the golf range. And I'll try to estimate, or they put an estimation as to the amount of revenues that would be generated, and then a rough estimate of the amount of transactions for those. So with that, Madam Chair, I'll turn it over to you if you have any questions for the director or for us.
I don't see any answers. I guess we're done with this.
Can I ask you a question?
Mr. Lebowski.
It's not specifically about the budget, but since John is here, Schroeder Park. Can you give me a quick synopsis of where we're at with that?
Actually, I think Senator just left. I've been working pretty closely with her. Shelby, I believe, is aware of this as well. I anticipated that there'll be some new language coming forward, ordinance change, code change. November, being proposed to strengthen the capacity of Parks and Recreation, not in enforcement, but in a citation authority, so that we can apply what we know to the people who are causing this extreme grief right now, and then turn that over to law enforcement and let them do follow-up. They'll actually then have a record go into their database and more tools, if you will, for us all to share, and hopefully we can lessen some of the damages.
I appreciate that. I talked to Chief Means just briefly about the topic before he left, and so I just wanted to follow up because I hadn't heard where it was in the process. So
It's a big problem, but I've been working a lot with Seneca and actually Gary Dillon maybe quite a number of conversations about how to do this.
Thank you, Mr. Lebowski. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So with the changes that you're proposing to Russian Jack, is it still going to be $8 for a round of golf, or is it going up to 10? Or
Nope. The
it'll be just 8?
just standardizing this is what the general public is asking for. Stay away from the other rates, go to the season pass, go to a one-time. You'll see the dramatic increase and you're out there frequently. Like the amount of people using Russian Jack, particularly after we did the improvements 2.5 years ago,
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Cruz and Mr. Hall.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Just one quick question. Mr. Rada, with the fee changes that you're proposing here, will that actually cover the cost of services provided, or is this just offset the cover?
This will cover the services.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. I don't see any other hands, so Mr. Rada, thank you very much. Mr. Wilbur, please continue.
Madam Chair, if we could, let's go back to slide 7, I believe it is, and we'll work with development services. And we'll back on track, and I think we'll be on time. So I think I have Ms. Walsh with me and Ms. Brooks to talk about the proposed changes for including a surcharge for the E-plan review, which we talked about is going to start in the first quarter. Proposing a small surcharge for applicants when they are using the E-plan so that we can recover the capital cost of E-plan, and we provided some estimates of what 0.0005 would account for. So if you have any questions about the timing or the logic, I would ask Ms. Walsh or Ms. Brooks to help the Assembly understand that.
Thank you, Mr. Wilbur. Ms. Johnson?
So, if a contractor doesn't pay the surcharge, does that mean that the contractor is able to just bring the traditional drawings to the permitting system?
Our plan is to apply it across the board. It would be the when they bring in their application, it would apply to, because, yeah. It's likely that we would actually load their plans into the electronic systems when the reviewers can review them working anyway, even if they didn't submit them electronically.
And when you say $120 surcharge for a $240,000 home, is that the average, or is it anything above $240,000?
It would be that.
It's that multiplier right there, 0.0005 times valuations, whatever the valuation
Okay,
is.
I see. I'm sorry.
And
I was smiling.
But the intent is that it apply against all projects, which would be inside and outside BSSA, because there's reviews involved still. And the S version, we'll have to add one more line in the S version to make sure that that is picked up and clear.
Anything else, Ms. Johnson?
I'm just kind of getting my head around it.
Okay, so we'll come back to you. Mr. Evans?
I was just wondering, does the department contemplate that the E-plan review, once it's up and fully operational, will provide efficiencies in the department, less hours, less duplication of effort, things like that? Is that
Absolutely, there's lots of efficiencies. There's starting with the people that don't have to come down to the public. They don't have to come down to development services. They can, if you're an architect, engineer, you can submit from your office. If you're a homeowner, you can submit a PDF. It'll handle all kinds of formats, so you can submit it from your home computer. So that's one efficiency for the public. And then once for the municipal staff side, there's going to be much less running around trying to find the plans. There's going to be less storage problems. We have giant old plans that come in, and they're required to submit 3, and there's a lot of time spent in processing all that paper. So that will be efficient. And a reviewer could call up the engineer and say, "I'm looking at your page, 6 of 16 in this corner. I have a question about this column," and they can pull it up on theirs, and together they can look at it in real time on the same system. And we really expect a lot of good things out of it.
if I may follow up? I guess what I'm getting at is if when I see something that's a surcharge, it's usually taxed on to help offset the added costs brought about by whatever the thing is. And I was wondering, other than the capital cost of creating the whole E-plan and the computer parts of it and the IT parts of it, is it going to be more expensive for the city to review these plans with the E-plan system, or is it going to be cheaper to do so?
We'll still have the same staff, costs. We're not planning to lay off staff. We'll be able to increase our response times. So I would think that's where you'll see the difference. decrease our response times. And we also want to point out that the plan is to retire this as soon as the initial investment is accounted for. So we estimate between 2 and 3 years we can retire the surcharge.
Thank you, Ms. Evans. Ms. Johnston?
And you can tell that I'm having trouble with this. So a lot of it should be coming out of Fund 181.
Well, yes, some. 101 is also affected because land use review still involves plan submittal, and this will enable those customers to also submit electronically. So we expect them to take advantage of using the system, so we also, need to account for that.
And I'm having sort of same problems that maybe Mr. Evans is having, because this is a capital cost, and we're asking a window of basically municipal clients to pay for it.
We actually picked this model up from some other jurisdictions that have done the same thing, and it's been a good sell in the other places. The architects, engineers are so happy to have this service. There hasn't been much pushback in the other jurisdictions that have done this method.
And have you explored it with any of our current contractors or architects?
We've been talking about it for the last couple of years with with everyone from the home builders to the architects, engineers, commercial clients, and they all can't wait. They're very excited with this.
Well, I know that, we're all excited about e-plans, but do they have any issues if you say, if we have this basically surcharge where they're basically financing the new system? Have you heard any issues from any of them?
No, we haven't. If you looked at some of these, if you look at the cost to send an employee down to the permit center and sit in line, and what they'll be gaining from not having to do that, they'll be gaining efficiencies as well. And printing costs. Printing costs alone are saving quite a lot of money.
And I haven't read this ordinance yet, but do you have a sunset date
Yes.
in here?
What you've appropriated is $583,720 for e-plan review. Excuse me, and that's for the contractor that's going to provide the system, setting it up, for all the hardware that's needed, and a project contingency for the project. But once that's been paid off, then the surcharge will go away. And
it's on it.
It depends on how construction valuation goes, up and down as to when exactly we're going to pay it off. But it looks like probably before the end of year 3, it would be paid off, is our guess.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. I don't think any other questions. Oh, Mr. Peterson, I'm sorry.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And so the column on the right is the additional cost of the result of the e-plan review. What is the total cost of the plan review? This is the 120, say the additional cost. What would the total be?
It's different. There's different rates for different things, but I think like the rate for commercial building plan review is 0.031. Let me look and make sure I got it right. I might be missing 1 0 there.
We can get back to you.
I've got the table. Okay, 0.0031 is the rate for commercial plan review. Residential building plan review is 0.005, and then there's some other rates for other kinds of what the plan review fee is. But what the rate is for your e-plan surcharge is the same rate against valuation for whatever the project is. And it's an additional amount. You have your plan review fee, and then this is the surcharge for electronic plan review. And obviously what you pay depends on your valuation.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Steele?
Yeah, this is an AutoCAD compatible system. Is that true? That the architects drop their plans on an AutoCAD, and if you have a question on a particular page, they go to that page, make the correction, and ship it to you right on the spot.
But one of the reasons that we chose the company we did is because it can accept so many formats. Literally, it can accept a PDF of a cocktail napkin sketch, and all the way up to the most sophisticated different AutoCAD types of notes.
But the benefit of the quick response, quick turnover is also applicable to any community.
Correct. I mean, with this system, you can have conference calls where everybody's at their computers and looking at the problem.
To me, that's the nightmare, is going down, having a reviewer find something, giving their plans back, they go back, have to redraw the whole set, and come back and get it viewed. It seems to me that's a huge advantage to anybody, whether it be a homeowner or a contractor or whoever.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Steele. Mr. Evans?
Yeah, math is definitely not my strong suit, so if I'm mistaken on this, straighten me out. But it seems like under the format you're describing, this type of surcharge would have a greater percentage increase on the lower value homes, because you're adding. Because right now, if I understand.
No, well, for new construction, it's always a percentage valuation.
Right.
And for residential, it's the same multiplier for a residential plan review, whether it's an expensive home or a less expensive home.
Right.
So the percent is the same.
But like for, say, your $240,000 home there, the surcharge 0005, which would be the same 0005 for a commercial building, but it's obviously a higher value. But currently, if I understood you correctly, the total cost or the permit cost for a residential home is 0005. So essentially it would double.
Yeah, well, I was looking through the table here. Usually for building a brand new house, there's, so you would have the residential plan review fee apply. I believe you'd also have the residential land use plan review fee apply. And so.
Mr. Chairman, could we provide the Assembly with a detailed written response to this question using these three examples and providing you the comparison against the additional cost of the surcharge versus the anticipated total permit fee associated with that?
That'd be great.
I think that's something we could probably get you before the end of the day today.
Mr. Abbott, I think that's a really good suggestion, and so that's what I'll happen if you don't mind, Mr. Abbott.
No, that'd be perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Anything else, Mr. Lynch? Thank you, you and your staff. Mr. Rogan, please continue.
So our last department is Health and Human Services, so I'm going to ask Ms. Freeman to come on up with her team, and we're going to start with the proposed changes to animal control. They have recommended changes for animal control, food safety, and cemetery, so and child care. So the first slide that you have on slide 10 as it relates to animal control. If you have any specific questions as it relates to their proposal, start with that.
Mr. Lasky?
Thank you. Melinda, I know you were here earlier. Can you articulate, when we were asking about animals and the fines for having animals now, it's proposed to be $100. Can you explain to me what the parameter of that law is currently? Because I'm just not aware.
I'll defer to Deanne Petco, our program manager of the animal control contract.
So the animals in public places, you are allowed to have your animal in a public place. This really refers to if you were to tie it up to a tree or something and just leave it, it has to be under control by a leash by a competent vet.
Oh, so like if somebody goes into the bank, if they actually tie up their dog outside, which I've seen before, which they've been nice dogs, but that's not allowed. Now, I know I have, LB and I worked on this a while back, so did John Rada, and so did Representative Gruenberg. We were talking about potential violations or the issue with having, for example, I used the term alligator earlier, but specifically, you know, we had a very interesting individual in my, why does it always have to be my district? But in my district that was bringing his pet alligator to the park. Has animal control, I just got an email, I just sent it back to Representative Gruenberg just yesterday, but it's been something on a state level we've been trying to articulate. But from your perspective, has there been any more work on that or discussion about that or how we're going to handle that?
So animal care and control only deals with domestic pets. So this is obviously an alligator would be a wild animal. So it's not something that is under our purview. So the state really.
So I'm in the right place, is what you're telling me. I thought so. I just, I hate dealing with it. It's such a stupid topic, but obviously there's people out there that will come up with things for us to legislate. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mosky. Mr. Trainee?
Your Animal Control Advisory Board met last night. Did they go through these fines and fees and make some recommendations, or did they have with everything that came before you?
They did go through the fees and fine schedule. They had a couple of additional recommendations and passed a resolution to that effect, and we will get that to you.
Thank you, appreciate that. And this is a policy thing. I understand if I'm looking on page 18 to 25, line 29, unregistered dogs and cats. Why are we releasing them to the public if in fact the problem is for the unsterilized dogs and cats breeding? Then we've got a continual building problem out there. Why do we only have the fee $85 versus a nothing? Why not make it $200 or not release unsterilized animals?
In addition to this release fee, there would also be a citation. Potentially, if there had been a loose animal, they would also have to pay other fees to redeem their animals, such as licensing the dog and vaccinations, potentially boarding fees. So it's not only the $85 that they would have to pay.
How often do people get an animal and they say they're going to get sterilized, but they don't? We keep a roster of how many people there are that do that.
We do require all of the dogs and cats that are adopted from animal control to be sterilized. Many of the cats and some of the dogs are sterilized right on site. Some do go out on a deposit with the understanding that they have to complete that surgery within 30 days. And if they do not do that, then they will receive a citation. But there are some folks that don't comply, but for the most part, people do.
What will we need to sterilize every dog and cat leaving the facility? You said some are sterilized there. How much money would it take to sterilize all of them so we don't have a problem with continual reproduction of the animals?
We would need some facility modifications in order to do that because we really don't have the space the recovery space for completing those surgeries on all those animals.
When you get a chance, would you send me just a list of what we would have to have? I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. Mr. Steele?
Yeah. I suspect you're going to hear from a few people who walk their dogs in the morning, go down and get coffee. Just drive the dog outside the coffee shop, go and get coffee, because they will break the law. And I'm sure there's other examples of that. Anyway, that's what the body would like to see.
It's clear, this is already against the law. We're just changing the fine for that behavior.
Thank you, Mr. Adler. Mr. Steele, anything else? No. Thank you, Mr. Steele. I don't see anybody else. Thank you, Ms. Pestel and Ms. Freeman. Mr. Wilbur, is that it?
No, that's not it.
Okay.
Health and Human Services has a lot to share today.
Oh,
So
great.
in the last 4 minutes, we're going to do the Memorial Park Cemetery and child care and food service.
Okay, great.
Great. So the next one we have is Memorial Park Cemetery. I think primarily their adjustments are related to just making adjustments. They haven't made any since 2004. So I think really they're just catching up with modern times. So with that, Madam Chair, I'll turn it over to you and members of the Assembly.
I don't see any questions, so next.
Excellent.
Thank
Well
you.
done.
Thank you. Rob Jones, Services Director.
All right, we're going to lead off with that next year. So the next one is child care licensing. I have Mr. Morris is going to join us. I know there's been some conversations and some interest in child care licensing. So the department is making some recommendations. While as I mentioned in the beginning, it's a small dollar amount. It might affect many businesses. I think it's appropriate to make the adjustments. So I'll turn it over to the Assembly members and have Melinda and Steve address your specific questions as it relates to child care licensing.
I don't see any questions, so I just want to say thank you, Mr. Morris. Next. Oh, Mr. Mullins, are you not? Okay, thank you.
No questions regarding travel care licensing?
Yeah.
All right, so the next one we have is food safety and sanitation. The proposed ordinance does have some adjustments in proposed fees for licenses as it relates to food sanitation. And I think this is primarily the bulk of the proposed $150,000 in fee increases for the Department of Health and Human Services. So I'll turn it over to you, Madam Chair, members of the Assembly.
I don't see any questions, so thank you, Mr. Morris, and thank you, Mr. Freeman. Mr. Peterson?
I was just looking, if you go back on page 12, going into child care facilities. So right now, someone who's taking care of 8 children or fewer during the day pays no licensing fee to be a child care provider.
That's correct.
And so what will their cost be with, adding them to the fee list?
I think it's $50.
$50 a year? Okay, I think that can handle that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I don't see any other questions. Mr. Evans?
Just real quick, the fees for some of these, I noticed, restaurants, mobile facilities were increased in 2013, not that long ago. What is sort of the rationale? We're going to have more just frequent, smaller increments, or why are these going up again, I guess is the question.
I think we increased fees in 1999, 2009, and 2013. We played catch up in 2009. We were behind. Basically, Harris, if you like, but we're running very close to the CPI increase. If you look at the time frame from 2009 to 2016. So I think in 2009 we didn't want to do dramatic increases because they've been so long. And we're sort of playing catch up right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. I don't see any other questions. So again, thank you, Mr. Morris, thank you, Mr. Freeman. Mr. Wilson?
Madam Chairman, I think, as I mentioned from our previous work sessions, if the Assembly has questions, please send them to us. Our plan would be to return those to you as soon as we possibly can. If you have not received the responses to questions from the 9th, and then we have a couple more from the work session from the 16th, and any questions that you brought today, we'll respond to those to you as soon as we can.
So my question is, when can we anticipate receiving the responses from the questions, especially from the 9th?
I
Are
will
they all
check
going to be
on,
together?
I will check on those as soon as I can.
Okay, and since Mr. Moore is still here, I have a question, and you don't have to answer it now unless you can, because I think everybody would probably be interested, and it's not to do with fees and fines, it's just to do with the budget. So PFD garnishments, how much was budgeted for 2015 budget, and what did you actually collect?
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
We've received our first 2 batches, and we budgeted somewhere around 4.5 million, and we will be right on top of that budget. So it was a decent year. We are seeing more and more competition from other agencies that have higher priority according to statute. So it's, even though the pie has gotten bigger, the competition has also been increased. So.
Good. And I just want to follow up, so what's the budget for 2016?
For 2016, we only took it up about $100,000. The dividend itself is not expected to bump up much more. Obviously, it actually could start going down depending on decisions. But we, about $100,000 is the increment. Everything else, we don't expect any other major influences this coming year. We monitor real carefully in terms of the competition and future state decisions that could impact us.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Mr. Drain has a question.
Lance, I've got a question for you. Can you get with Dean Gates, because he writes such good legislation? What I'm looking for is a mechanism to have the CPI added into the fines. So every 2 years, they're all adjusted based on the CPI. Because I remember in 2001 when we raised them, they had been raised in 10 years, and everybody had sticker shock. Now we're 15, we haven't done it since 2001. People get sticker shock. So I'm looking for something that Dean Gates can create for us, that every 2 years is adjusted for this CPI for all the fines and fees. It happens automatically unless the Assembly says no to it.
Madam Chair, Mr. Trainee, I've already mentioned this to Mr. Falsey, so the legal department is aware of it, and we will prepare a response for that. So if we can, how we would do it, if we can't, how we would.
Well, Dean Gates is here and he writes pretty well.
Yes, he does, and I know that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Train. Mr. Mayor, did I see your hand?
No,
Okay.
no.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, this, it doesn't look like it. This work session is adjourned. Thank you.